Now, we are currently hearing different perspectives on the Supreme Court ruling that took place last month that the terms woman and sex in 2010 Equality Act refer to a biological woman and biological sex. The judgment has implications for many organisations. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, has issued interim guidance on April 26th. For example, in workplaces and services that are open to the public, trans women, those people with gender recognition certificates and those without, should not use women's facilities such as toilets or changing rooms. We are looking at the practical dilemmas this ruling creates for organisations, businesses and individuals. On Monday, if you were tuned in, you will have heard from the barrister Robin Moira White, who is a trans woman and activist who specialises in taking discrimination cases. Today, we hear from the human rights charity Sex Matters, who supported the Group for Women Scotland in challenging the Scottish Government at the Supreme Court. Sex Matters were one of only 4 organisations allowed to intervene in the appeal. Helen Joyce is the Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters and also author of Trans When Ideology Meets Reality. Welcome to Woman's Hour.
It's lovely to be on.
Well, a month on from the ruling as we are now, what would you say has been the reaction from supporters of your organisation, Sex Matters?
Feelings of vindication and joy, because this clarifies the law as it always has been in the 15 years since the Equality Act was passed, and it makes it clear what women have always known, which is that if you want to have single-sex spaces, you want to protect women's human rights, then you're going to actually have to talk about sex, and those single-sex spaces are going to have to be on the basis of sex. You can't have a female-only space that allows some males in. That's really oxymoronic.
What we're talking about, though, Helen, as you know, is some of the issues that are raised by this ruling. And I'm wondering what sort of questions your supporters might be raising with you about this clarification of the law, really about it being interpreted at ground level.
So people overwhelmingly want to know what they can say to their employers or what they can say to service providers. So what I would say to them is that they can say to their workplace, where 1992 regulations require that you have single-sex spaces, and that really means sex, that if they have not been clear to your co-workers that means no men, no matter how they identify, are to use the women's spaces, that now they must actually make that clear. We wrote to the Health and Safety Executive and they replied to us. We've tweeted out the letter and put it on our website. And the HSE says that it's not enough to put up the signs male and female. Employers actually have to make sure that people understand what those mean, and that if a man comes into the women's toilets, you can go to HR, you can say, can you ask him to stop doing this, please? If he continues, you can ask them to raise a disciplinary. If your employer won't do this, you can write to the HSE or your local authority, because a man who keeps coming into women's spaces is committing sexual harassment. And
just to clarify to our audience, in reference there, when you say men, who are you talking about?
I'm talking about all male people, however they identify, and whether or not they have paperwork saying that they have an acquired gender of female.
So that would, all biological men, including those who would refer to themselves as trans women?
That's correct.
And for our audience also, with the term trans women, is it that you won't use it or don't use it?
So it's a belief system that I just don't share. I don't think that people have inner essences that make them male or female. I recognise that human beings are mammals, that we can't change sex. And my main concern is women's human rights. Women cannot have human rights if we can't name who's a man and who's a woman, because some of women's human rights require us to be able to exclude all men, for example, from spaces where we undress or where we are vulnerable. And if I call some men women, then I can't explain why those men aren't able to come in. So it's not about being mean or rude to anyone. Man, male, he, him, these are not nasty words. They're just the ordinary words for the half of humanity who are male.
And of course, some are not asking to be called women. Some maybe. They're asking to be called trans women.
But they're still men. Trans women are men. And that's what the Supreme Court confirmed.
Did you ever use the term?
Trans women, I suppose when I started out looking at this subject, but then I realised that I wasn't being asked for a polite accommodation. I was being asked to give up the rights for women. So now I could understand how somebody would use these words to a friend, in polite conversation and so on. But when we're talking about arrangements that are for everybody, when we're talking about workplace toilets, changing rooms, rape crisis centres and so on, we've seen how if we've given an inch, they've taken 10,000 miles. So I now just call all men men, and I call them trans-identifying men. And then we're really clear about who we're talking about. This isn't to insult anyone. People can believe what they like about themselves. They can believe what they like about humanity. But they can't impose their beliefs on other people. So I use my words, and I'm fine with other people using their words. And hopefully we can all rub along together that way.
Yes, although there has been massive conflict instead of rubbing along together. You mentioned domestic abuse services there. There are some, as you will probably have seen, that say they will continue to accept trans women. Refuge, for example, the largest specialist domestic abuse organisation in the UK, on the day of the ruling said it would not change the way it operates. Just some of the words from their statement. We remain firmly committed to supporting all survivors of domestic abuse, including trans women. Their CEO, who is Gemma Sherrington, has clarified in a statement it will continue, this is from Refuge, it will continue to provide single-sex accommodation and services in full accordance with the law, as well as other safe housing and community-based options to support all survivors of domestic abuse. Ultimately, the way Refuge operates will not change, and we will continue to adopt an inclusive approach that meets the needs of all survivors. Your view on that?
That sounds exactly right. You need to meet you need to meet the needs of everybody. But female people often need there to be no male people in spaces. So you can support everybody, but you don't do that by pretending that some men are women. Of course, some men are subjected to domestic violence, both men who identify as trans and men who don't. And a domestic abuse charity may well seek to support them too. But if it pretends that some men are women and it puts those men in spaces that are called female only, they're now breaking the law. Because you can't operate a single-sex service and allow some people of the opposite sex in. You've lost the basis whereby you are running that service.
So what would you expect people to do in terms of Refuge, for example?
I'm not running Refuge, so I don't know what the numbers are. But what you will find in any domestic abuse service is that most of the people who are domestically abused, seriously domestically abused especially, are women, female people. And so that'll be your main thrust. And then you can think, how do you have add-on services for other people? For example, men who have been abused by women, abused by other men, trans-identifying men, and you will provide services for them.
Are you concerned that they are not going to change their practices?
Yes, I am quite concerned, because there's been a lot of disinformation and misinformation, including, I have to say, on Monday in this show.
Well, we'll talk about, and that is your interpretation of it, and we'll speak about some of what Robin brought up and your thoughts on them. If I go back indeed to the terminology, which things often come back to as well, and this is the reason it's a tricky one, right? For some people, some of our audience listening will be with you, maybe even outraged that I'm asking you about your choice of words
at all.
And at the same time, other listeners will find the terms that you use offensive, antagonistic, or even a way to erase trans women. You brought up Monday's programme. That was Robin Moira-White, who's a barrister, who's a trans woman and an activist, and reacted to being described as a man, saying those who do it are being deliberately offensive, generally when they do. The choice of referring to someone in an unpleasant way is a choice.
It was great that you then brought up the things that Robin has said about me and my organisation. He has called us vile, evil. He's called Sex Matters a hate organisation. And then he segued straight on to, if you remember, the Battle of Cable Street. So what he was doing there was that he was positioning women who campaign for female-only spaces, women like me, as directly equivalent to Oswald Mosley's brown shirts, to fascists. And he was positioning men like him, trans-identifying men like him, who are a small minority of men, who insist that despite the law, he said he was going to keep using women's spaces despite the law, he is positioning men like him as being brave human rights defenders. This is a complete inversion. What he is doing is he's seeking to destroy women's rights. So, I don't really feel very sympathetic to men who say they want to destroy women's rights.
And with that language, which he used, for example, some would consider it inflaming, and others would also consider your organisation, Sex Matters, as anti-trans. Some you will have heard even calling it a hate group, which is a really strong allegation, and feel by not meeting halfway with the choice of language, reinforcing that.
I mean, I just don't see why I should be tiptoeing around the fact that there is a man who is saying that despite a Supreme Court ruling, he is going to come into spaces where he is by definition excluded for the sake of women's human rights. I don't feel like tiptoeing around somebody like that. And if I call that man a woman, what I'm saying is that there are some women who don't belong in women's spaces. That's not the fact. The point is that no men belong in women's spaces. And the men who argue for this are precisely the sort of men we most need to keep out. It's absolutely essential that we use these words. And I would remind your listeners that I work for a human rights charity, and that the barrister who is our chair and the lawyers who are on our board are the people who have been on the winning side of case after case in the Employment Tribunal and now in the Supreme Court, and that the arguments that we make are based on human rights. You can only find this Supreme Court ruling surprising if you don't pay attention to women's human rights. It's 88 pages of clarity on the subject of how everybody has the same human rights, and that women in particular need to be able to say no to all men in order to protect our human rights.
And Robin identifies as a trans woman, just to underline that. On your website, Sex Matters, you say many organisations are now digging in and resisting complying with the law. Even those that want to do the right thing are confused and frightened. You go on to say, your organisation, how can they be confident in treating people based on their actual sex when there is no way of accurately verifying that information? It was also reported by the BBC a couple of weeks ago that more than 1,000 cultural figures have signed an open letter which claims the judgment overlooks the need to protect trans people and non-binary intersex from discrimination, and that the majority of cultural venues are unable to magic up toilet facilities, and they're also unable and unwilling to police which toilets people use. And although coming from different viewpoints, the outcome is the same. What is your organisation advising people to do on the threshold of toilets and changing rooms?
I mean, everybody knows what sex they are, and the first thing to do is to set really clear rules and expectations. It's a bit like speed limits. We don't say we can't have a speed limit just because you might break the speed limit on a country road at 4 a.m. and not get caught. You set clear rules and you expect people to follow the clear rules. I don't start from the position that people who identify as trans can't be expected to follow clear rules. They can be expected to follow the same rules as everybody else when those rules are fair and lawful. So just make it clear that you have male facilities and female facilities, and that whenever possible you have a third unisex option that is there for anyone who is not happy using the facilities for their sex. And then remember, for a long time women have been told that we must be kind and we must be inclusive. It's really time that men budge up here. So, I mean, Robin seemed very sure that if he went into the men's toilets, the other men would be mean to him. I wouldn't be so sure about that. I think that most men we know from opinion polls, think that trans-identifying men should stay out of women's spaces. They're actually very keen on that. So I think most men will be much more welcoming than Robin thinks if he went into the men's.
I think what Robin was saying is that they have never had an issue using women's facilities.
Not true. It's simply not true. We know this. We hear from thousands and thousands of people in our inbox, but also when we have done focus groups and opinion polls, we know that women care about single-sex spaces. Everybody does. Yes, there are some women who don't mind, but also, Robin is very tall. He's a very imposing character, very, very big. I've been with him in person, and that is not somebody that I would want to challenge in a space where he's not meant to be.
But there are these questions about who's going to police the toilets. Do you have an answer to that?
No, there are no toilet police. I expect people to follow the rules. In a workplace, a man who keeps going into the women's toilets, you can report him to your HR department. You can ask HR to bring a disciplinary against him, and you can say that he is committing sexual harassment.
But as you've heard, Helen, just some of the examples I put forward, people are not, some people and some organisations are not complying with the law in the way that you would like them to, and don't seem to have any intention to.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that the HSC will go beyond just replying to us in the letter that, as I say, we've put on our website. They really need to put a statement on their own website saying what they told us, which is that, yes, workplaces are expected to make it clear to everybody that they don't use facilities for the opposite sex. But, in the last analysis, a man who keeps coming into spaces where women get undressed is a man who is committing a sexual harassment crime. Although
they are also to be afforded privacy, dignity, and to not be harassed or discriminated against.
Yes, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that they come into women's spaces. Women's spaces are for women. That's non-negotiable. Then the second order question is, how do you accommodate men who are not happy in men's spaces? And of course that's important. But you can't do it by putting them into women's spaces, because then the women's spaces cease to be women only.
All I'm saying is that they are there at the moment, and some organisations, as it appears to me, don't seem ready or willing to change that despite the ruling.
We've seen in the last in the last week, I would say, we've seen an encouraging sign that organisations are starting to ask their general counsel rather than their EDI function. For example, Wetherspoons have made it very clear. They've just said, clearly, the women's toilets are for female people, the men's toilets are for male people, don't use the wrong ones. So more and more of them are starting to go to the right part of the company, which is the part that talks to them about legal liability.
You do know that Victoria McLeod, the High Court judge who is trans, has told the BBC she's going to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg.
Yes, I did hear that.
Why do you laugh when you hear that?
Well, I talk to a lot of barristers and lawyers who are on the winning side in these cases, and none of them are at all worried about this. It's not usual for the ECHR to take cases at all from people who weren't party to particular cases. So I wouldn't really expect there to be much traction on this.
A very different take than what I got on Monday. What about boys, young boys, being brought by their mothers into toilets, if in the ruling boy and man is the same thing?
Yeah, that was a very interesting bit of legerdemain there by Robin, wasn't there? It's quite standard for places to put up a sign saying this is the ladies' toilets and you can bring in minors with you up to, say, age 7.
But there is no guidance on it.
No, but I mean, you don't have to assume that people are going to be idiots on this. Everybody knows what the difference between a grown man and a child.
But it's not about being an idiot, Helen. It's about people having very different ideological views and interpretations of what the words are on a ruling or on guidance.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court has really said very, 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 very clearly that when we say male or we mean man, and when we say female, we mean woman. Yes, organisations can have an agreement where you can bring an accompanied minor of the opposite sex in. That doesn't mean an unaccompanied
Until
adult.
what age?
It will depend from organisation to organisation.
I will leave it there because I want to give equal time to everybody who's giving me some opinions on this particular ruling that engenders strong feelings. Thank you very much to Helen Joyce, Director of Advocacy for Sex Matters. Going forward, we will be hearing from more of the organisations that submitted evidence to the Supreme Court in this case. On Friday, Anita will speak to Amnesty International UK. On Monday, I'm speaking to LGP Alliance. And if you missed the barrister, activist and trans woman Robin Moira-White, who we're speaking about, who was on Monday's programme, you can catch up on that on BBC Sounds. It's the 12th of May episode on Woman's Hour. Thanks very much, Helen.
Thank you.